Right, good morning everybody. Welcome to day 6 of the examination of the Jersey Bridging Island Plan. As I think most of you know, my name's Jeff Salter. I've been appointed to assist Mr. Keith Holland, and I'll be taking the sessions today in examining the plan. We've got, I think, a few new faces, a couple, so I'm sorry for those of you that heard this before, but I'll briefly run through my normal introductory remarks. First, I just wanted to remind everybody that our main purpose in running this examination is to meet the regulations, we're charged with ensuring that the Bridging Island Plan is supported by adequate evidence, is an appropriate strategy for sustainable development, is capable of delivery, and contributes to wider government objectives. I'll come on to mobile phones in a minute. I always like to say that because it sort of tries to keep the discussion in focus, and I'd like to stress that we've read all the representations and documents, and the intention in the hearings is to focus on the key issues which we want to explore a bit further and to deal with some questions that we may have, and that we're not really here to listen to formal presentations. There's not much point in that. We've heard them all and we've read them all. As you've seen from the programme, today's session is about the economy. I thought I did. It's showing red. Would you like me to wait a minute? Okay. Is that all right now? Is it not recording? Is it not live streaming? What's happening? Do you want me to try the other one? Is that any better? Yeah, that's better, isn't it? Is that okay? Yeah. I'll just move over. Right. Do I need to repeat any of that for anyone else? It was primarily aimed at the people in the room. Okay, fine. Let's move on then. So that's what we're here to do today. We're dealing with the economy session, which has got 3 main items. A general question, which I don't think will take very long. We're then going to have an issue about the proposed allocation of employment further at industrial sites, and then policy EV1, which is needs some discussion following the state's supplementary representation. Couple of health and safety announcements. I mean, in the light of recent developments, there's no requirement to wear masks, but you may wish to keep a mask on if you're not participating. We appreciate, and I can't do it, that you can't really participate with a mask on properly. Just bear that in mind, please. We're not expecting any fire alarms, so if there is an alarm, it's for real. Please leave the building by the back doors and congregate on the lawn outside. Please turn mobile phones off, and please introduce yourself if not done by me, and put your boards so that I can see them. The microphones are for live streaming and for the virtual participation and for the recording. I don't think they really broadcast around the room, so you do need to speak into the microphone for that purpose, and also to try and raise your voice so that everybody can hear you. I hope everyone can hear me all right from what I'm saying. but please bear that in mind when you're speaking. And raise your name board if you wish to speak, but I will introduce people and I'll start off looking at the general questions. We've got the evidence base for the economy session was primarily, I think, the Arup Employment Study 2020. But we recently had 2 weeks ago, I think, the Fiscal Policy Panel report was published, which is updating some economic data for the whole of the island. Sort of in summary, it seems to me that, like everywhere else, GVA, gross value added, in the island dropped by 8.7%, I think, in 2020. But there's sort of an improving position already in 2021, and hopefully the latest COVID developments won't slow that down too much. And I noticed you've had a sort of deficit of 83 million for 2021, but the fiscal report states that you expect to be back in balance by 2024. So, I mean, it seems to me the island's economy is in reasonably good shape compared to many other places. And I didn't really particularly want to spend too much time on the retail and office sectors, but I just wanted to quickly ask the states to comment on, in the light of the Fiscal Panel Policy Report. You're not, I don't think, expecting any real change in the retail sector. Is that correct? No major schemes are sort of likely to come forward, and the report seemed to say that you know, that there might be some development in the convenience retailing sector, but generally there's nothing too major that's likely to be proposed, or any major changes in that sector. Is that correct?
I think so. It's probably just worth highlighting the fact that in the plan we recognise that the retail sector is under challenge, not necessarily related to the pandemic, although the pandemic may have accelerated some of the trends, but under challenge from things like online shopping. And we've sought to respond to that by seeking to make some changes to the spatial extent of the core retail area, for example, to the spatial extent of the town centre for St Helier. Mainly as a way of seeking to maintain the vitality and vibrancy of the retail core of St Helier, but also to enable those complementary uses, those other town centre uses that might complement the core retail function of the town centre. So I think the plan seeks to make some changes to do that. Obviously, Jersey is a little different to places in the UK in the sense that we have a captive market on the island, as it were, and the principal challenge is around online shopping. But
so
essentially,
does the town centre boundaries changed, has it?
The core retail area has shrunk. So compared to the 2011 island plan, we've reduced the scale of the core retail area, so it's focused very much now on the primary retail
That's
streets.
what it is. I wasn't aware that it changed much from the 2011 plan.
Okay, so and the effect of that is really to allow greater flexibility outside of that core retail area, and to enable other, as I say, other complementary town centre uses to come into effect in a wider town centre area for St Helier.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any significant representations about that.
No, I don't think there have been. So.
Okay. Similarly, I suppose there might be some implications which we might come on to for the online retailing. I've noted that, obviously, and that's UK-wide, probably Europe-wide and worldwide issue. That might have some implications for warehousing requirements, possibly, which we might want to discuss in the light industry warehousing section further on. But just bear that in mind. Offices, anything that you might want to add since the plan was prepared about what's been happening with offices and with regard to sort of home working, demand for office floor space? There was a 7% vacancy in December 2019, and that probably has changed a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We see, under the current plan, there was quite significant growth in office floor space provision in the island, principally Grade A office development focused around the waterfront, so on the International Finance Centre and areas adjacent to that. So the provision of office space is quite healthy, and the Jersey Development Company have scope to provide further office space on the waterfront, and we've also seen the private sector come forward with a number of other schemes along the esplanade, and there are still existing consents that have yet to be implemented in terms of provision of new office space. So I think the supply is relatively healthy. And the consequence of the provision of that Grade A space has meant that there's been lots of consolidation of office moves onto the waterfront into Grade A space, which has then freed up some of the secondary office market, and some of that has gone into other uses. But in terms of the bridging plan and the shorter plan period, we don't see any strong evidence to change the policy framework for office provision, sir. As I say, we consider there is provision already in the pipeline, and we seek to continue to focus larger office developments in and around the waterfront where there is capacity for those uses to come forward.
Okay. That's all I had on that. Anyone else want to comment on that? Yes, please. Who are you?
Alex Curtis. I run a local distillery and have been involved for a number of years in employment land matters. I think the preamble there and the justification around the vitality of the core St Helier area isn't then represented in that policy regarding office space. So whilst we've seen that shrinking of the core retail area to provide greater vitality and greater flexibility within the other parts of St Helier, the fact there is still no employment market test on ground floor office accommodation means we are seeing a breakup of the continuity of employment in public realm space within that area. So without a test, we're just seeing that actually there is no protection for new businesses to enter these areas. So it's in direct contrary.
So I'm not quite following you there. I guess I remember reading something from you, but so what are you saying? That
so whilst
there's no, if someone wants to, which area are we talking about? The primary area?
For a start, we're talking about any piece of employment office space that is classed as office has no market test to prove that there's no demand for it in its current or alternative employment use.
And you're saying that there should be?
I'm saying, first of all, there should be. A wider point on the sustainable framework for economic land, I think there should be a test on everything. But I think fundamentally, within that St Helier boundary, we are seeing plots of land where a ground floor can be turned to office space, which still provides interaction, brings people and footfall. But the moment it is turned to an office space, the market test that would have applied to another use no longer is applied. So we are seeing just down the street, for example, just outside the parish church, there are sites which, having been converted from retail to office, no longer have a policy test against them. And therefore, we are seeing the breakup of the continuity of shops to drive people to other parts of that that red hashed area of the St Helier town centre. Which to me would seem to be against keeping a vibrant and active town centre.
Some different points about market testing, which we're going to come on to with EV1 as well, I think. But I mean, okay, would the states like to respond to that to start off with, and then I'll take any other comments about that point?
Yeah, I think as I said, sir, we have shrunk the core retail area. So in terms of the retail vitality, that's very much focused on the primary shopping streets of King Street and Queen Street, with some extension down New Street, Halker Street and Bath Street. And we see that as the primary area of vitality, and clearly we seek to focus retail activity in those areas. In the wider town centre, sir, which embraces a wider area of St Helier, there is a market test for premises coming out of retail use and other complementary town centre uses. We haven't seen the need to impose a market test on change of use for office accommodation on the basis that there is we consider to be a healthy level of supply, both in terms of grade A accommodation, and as I said, sir, there has been a recycling, if you like, of the smaller secondary office accommodation, some of which has remained in secondary office supply, and some of which has come out to other uses, including conversion to residential, some with active ground floor activity as well.
Okay. I've noted the point. I'll come back to that possibly in another context about market testing. Okay, can we move on to the industry and warehousing point now? I think Mrs. Stephen, was it you made? Did you want to make any points? You've made a point about shortage of premises. Is that correct? Was that your point? And you seem to be, I was going to ask the Minister to respond to that, but your key points, it seemed to me, were that there is an alleged shortage of premises and sites. There's not really an up-to-date survey about this. Did you want to add anything further about that?
If I may say, you've seen the evidence. We've given the letters more recently from the commercial agents, and that's where the understanding comes from.
Have you got your microphone?
I have got it on, sir. Is it not?
I can't see. No, I just can't see that. Okay. Yep. Yep. Carry on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we're being told. So we're local consultants working with lots of people in the community, lots of commercial businesses, and we keep being told there's a shortage of employment land. And it's really difficult to get planning permission for employment uses outside of the built-up area. We know about the spatial strategy, and that's understood and accepted. If I may give you some Jersey context, which might help you understand why, in addition to the policies, it's difficult. Jersey doesn't have the same use classes as the UK, and most changes of use require a planning application. Employment land is defined in the Supplementary Planning Guidance, Protection of Employment Land. That goes through all the different employment uses. We don't have any industry as such, although the policy talks about industry. What we've got is the commercial and the warehousing uses that you've talked about, and the distribution uses. And even if you are in one of those protected zones, I think businesses are finding it more difficult to expand, diversify, change, because they're getting an objection from the Highway Authority, and also resistance to any ancillary use to do with retail. There are many businesses in the countryside, sir, which I don't think has been reflected or quantified as part of the evidence that has been collected to support this plan. But I'm very open, and please correct me if that understanding is wrong. There are pressures as well for businesses to leave the built-up area because land is more valuable for housing, and they're considered bad neighbours. We've also got the third-party appeal process, which puts small businesses in a difficult position. So when they have to renew planning applications, because a lot of the businesses in the countryside that are in an agricultural shed, it's very often subject to a temporary planning permission that has to keep being renewed. So when that renewal comes up, there is a planning application, and third parties then have the right to challenge. And what we're seeing very often is the planning committee, and for understandable reasons, will find favour with the third party and the residential use. So to cut a long story short, so it's really difficult to be a small business operating in Jersey. And my own personal view and observation is it would be good to see more flexibility from the policies supporting that more diverse small business range of needs. It's not just about St Heliers.
Yes, okay. I mean, I've also made some notes from, I don't know whether it was your representation on behalf of JD Norman, are you
Yes.
representing them?
Yep.
About rental increases of 20% over the last year or so, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Is that over 1 year?
I'd have to revisit.
Or
I haven't got those notes
I
in
couldn't
front of me.
remember, and less so in secondary space. Mr Nicholson, did you want to add to that?
I was going to echo a lot of those points, and I was going to point us to evidence which is before us all. So we can go back to the 2011 Inspector's report for the current island plan, and that is quite clear that in 2011, paragraph 7.35 of that report, sir, it says there's uncontested evidence that there is a clear and pressing need for modern light industrial premises on the island. There was an unmet need for light industrial distribution units, etc. There were no allocations made in the 2011 plan, despite that clear and pressing unmet need. If we go back to the evidence base gathered for this plan, sir, the Arup employment study, which I'm sure you've digested. In relation to light industrial, on pages 89 and 90, a shortage of supply is clearly referenced in there. The conclusions on page 99, particularly paragraph 3, they say policies which provide support for new sites are required. No new sites are allocated in the plan, sir. Paragraphs 5 and 6 of the conclusions fail to acknowledge exactly what Mrs. Steedman has said about built-up area values for light industrial failing. They just cannot compete with other uses.
Primarily residential.
I think there's a whole range of other uses.
Case. I mean, I've actually done work in this area quite a long time ago, but that's always that residential uses outbid.
Yep.
Industrial and warehouse use.
And of course we have the overall spatial strategy of the island, which perhaps enhances the competition within the built-up area. We then have the response of the government in their April 2021.
Well, hang on, you're not saying that's wrong, are you?
No, I'm saying it's not recognised in the way that
the
policy
spatial
has
strategy,
evolved.
I mean. Yeah.
No, quite the opposite. We've been through that a couple of weeks ago, so yeah. In the government's response to the call for sites process and the evidence, page 8 of that seems to acknowledge there is a requirement for some flexibility, particularly for light industrial uses outside the built-up area. But again, to echo what Mrs. Steedman has said, that is just not carried forward into the policy basis. EI1 does not really have any different flexibility beyond the current plan, when all the evidence of the government's own documents and the submissions that have been made are crying out for more flexibility, more opportunity. There are no allocations made, and the policy is no more flexible than it is at the moment, sir.
So are you recommending to us that EI1 should be changed?
I think EI1 being amended is probably what Mrs. Steedman was after as well. I think the direction of travel is clear from the evidence, and I just can't see it being reflected in the way that the policy is drafted, so yeah.
Okay, we'll come on to the detailed sites. No, hang on a minute, we'll come on to the detailed sites in a minute. I'd like the Minister to respond to the general point, some general points first, and then maybe particularly about EI1. Whether it's you or Mrs. Day, I don't mind, Mr.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I mean, I think we acknowledge the points that have been made. Clearly, in terms of the island plan review process, we did go for a call for sites process, which was run, sir. That was not just about provision of land for housing, it was also about provision of land for light industrial use or any other forms of development. We had about 40 submissions in relation to that call for sites for that particular form of use, and they were assessed against a range of criteria. And it was felt, sir, that none of those sites were particularly suitable for that particular purpose. In terms of the flexibility of policy, we would submit that the flexibility is provided in the policy framework, both at EI1 but also at ERE4, sir, which is the reuse of modern agricultural buildings. And as you will have gathered from the comments that have been made, essentially the policy framework in the plan to support light industrial use seeks to ensure that we continue to allow development on our existing protected industrial sites, of which there are 8 spread across the island. So we will allow intensification and redevelopment and extension on those protected industrial sites, in addition to which the policy in the draft plan also extends that provision to existing land and buildings outside of those protected industrial sites where they're currently in some form of light industrial use, so where that's established outside of those protected industrial sites and enjoys the benefit of planning consent, then the plan would support the further development of those sites.
What about a temporary permissions point?
I mean, clearly there are some challenges around the suitability of some of those sites. In the draft plan, we set out a series of tests against which proposals for redundant agricultural buildings might be assessed. So we clearly take forward the principle of seeking to make the best use of existing assets. So where land is already developed and used for a particular purpose, then where that's no longer required for that purpose, in carrying through that principle, we would then look to seek to make other uses of that asset, and that applies to the land and buildings that may have originally been used for agriculture throughout the countryside. So there is more flexibility in ERE4 that explicitly acknowledges that where those buildings are redundant to agriculture and where that's proven, then we will consider its use for other purposes, other employment-related purposes. But that is subject to a number of tests related to things like impact on any neighbouring uses and also on the capacity of the highway network. So,
any other comment on this overall point about the need for more land?
Well, I think so. As we've said,
you said that the call for sites didn't bring forward anything that you thought was suitable.
No, and I think the other point to make in relation to that, sir, is as we've stated in the plan. This is a short-term bridging plan, so we take the view that the greater flexibility that the draft policies introduce is sufficient to enable us to get through this bridging plan period. And in terms of longer-term supply, there may be opportunities that arise as a result of some of the rationalisation or change in the government estate, whether that's public land directly or whether it's land administered by some of the agencies of government, such as Ports of Jersey, sir, who are looking to make changes to their estate, both at the airport and at the harbour.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that later, actually. Does the government own La Collette?
Well, it's part of it is owned directly by the public. The other bit is owned by the Ports of Jersey, which is an incorporated body.
That's still public, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let's come on to. I've got a question about that later. Maybe you could help with that, Mr. Turner. But Ms. Scott, yeah.
Thank you, sir. What I just wanted to raise here was that. In terms of talking about the uses, like industrial uses and commercial uses, that it seems that the island plan could benefit more of a focus or a link between employment use and tourist destination areas. I would like to cite by example a site in St Bernard's Bay, which is a premier seaside resort and has a value in that respect, acknowledged by Visit Jersey and others, that recently there was an application to turn a restaurant into a car showroom in the bay, which which eventually was withdrawn, and it's been replaced with an approved application for a laboratory for cannabis exploring. Now, I believe this could happen anywhere in the bay, so I believe we request that you consider that maybe a little bit more of specification about the use of employment sites in tourist destination areas would be appropriate.
Do you want to respond to that, Mr. Pilley? That's not your point, I assume, Mr. Nicholson. No, okay, I'll come back to you in a minute then. Mr. Pilley?
Yes, sir. I mean, I think in terms of the tourist development areas, the policy framework seeks to encourage development that will support the tourism function of those areas. So places like St Bernard's Bay, St Aubin, St Helier and Gorey are identified as tourism development areas, and we would seek to encourage uses which complement their function as tourism development areas rather than wider industrial type uses. So
I think we might want to come back to that, Ms. Scott, under discussion of policy EV1 maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Nicholson.
Thank you, sir. I was just going to point out that EI1 doesn't give the flexibility that Mr. Pilley outlined. He referred to the opportunity to redevelop and reuse sites which might not be in the built-up area. That isn't in the island plan. It only says make use of existing buildings. And if we refer to ERE4, there's, in my reading, absolutely no additional flexibility in there compared to ERE5 in the current island plan. And again, it's about the reuse of modern farm buildings. They may not always be suitable, for example, for modern employment purposes, and the flexibility to use a site isn't in either ERE4 or ERE5 to redevelop it to meet modern light industrial warehousing needs. So that flexibility was outlined, but it doesn't reflect in the text of those policies. So.
Yeah, there's a sort of correlation, isn't there, with the not numbered, the third paragraph, I think it is, redevelopment or renewal, intensification of existing uses outside the built-up area, where they supported where they support rural diversification or make use of existing buildings. And you're saying that's insufficient?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a small point, sir, if I may, just to assist. It's my experience that very often the interpretation outside of the built-up area and protected zones is that a business needs to have some link with the rural economy or agriculture, and that, I think, is the point that we're struggling with, that the agriculture industry has shifted, again, over the last decade, and clearly the needs of warehousing, commercial uses have shifted again. I think that is where the tension arises, sir. Thank you.
Is it about the industrial point?
I just wanted to follow up. You did suggest that we discuss my last point in the context of policy EV1, but in fact it's more relevant to ER4, because I was talking about a restaurant that's daytime and evening use rather than visitor accommodation. But I believe I've made the point now, sir. If you could please consider it.
Mr. Minister, yes.
Hello. I wasn't going to speak on this, but people started bringing agricultural buildings into it, and I thought I should set. Well, it seems that people are suggesting that the planning department is suggesting that the location of any new light industrial units would be redundant farm buildings, it seems to me that there is a need for light industrial buildings because we have two problems. We have the increase of online shopping, which has meant a lot more warehousing space has been needed. And second point that I think local people will tell you, since the pandemic has started, people have realised that just-in-time shopping is not a very clever thing, and all our supermarkets have lost all their warehousing about between 5 and 10 years ago, and do it all in the UK, and now they're suddenly finding that we're struggling, and I think there is a demand for space. The situation, and it's covered in, the warehousing is covered, that older agricultural buildings, which I think we have got some in the agricultural industry, could be used for different purposes. But the buildings that are important to us and would be important to people who want warehousing are a sort of what I call big, tall agricultural buildings, because we've increased our productivity, for example, in potatoes by palletising everything. And in a shed that years ago on the floor space might have only got 10,000 boxes of potatoes, now puts in 35,000 because we store them three high, up to 18 foot tall. So I don't believe that our industry will be providing much warehousing space, because the sort of stuff that light industrial want for warehousing, that's what we need. So I just wanted to make that point, sir.
Okay. I think I think there's a disagreement there which I've noted, and we'll have to take a view on. It might be worthwhile now moving on to the individual sites, I think, because some of these problems are going to be sort of exemplified when we go through those. And I'm going to probably take them in the order that the states have put in SR 56. And I've got, and I think I put that on the agenda. I don't know if I did the detail. Oh, I didn't. I didn't list them on the agenda. But we've got Bienvenue Farm, La Solitude, Rondale Farm, Field 380, and Fields B26 and 27. So I'll take them in that order. Now, Bienvenue Farm, that was Senator Morell, wasn't it? Deputy Morell? Is he or she here? No. He's not here. Okay. He might be online. No, I don't think so. And I've not had any hands come up online so far. Well, okay, is that yours, isn't it, Mrs. Stephen? I mean, you've seen what the states have said in response, to your request. I mean, I've been there. I've not really been on it, but I've been around, and I think I know what's there. Their sort of point is really it shouldn't be. There's an existing designation, isn't there? And then you want an extension of that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Then, if I would be as bold to speak for Deputy Morell, it's a qualified designation just for storage use. It's not an unfettered commercial designation. It would be for the lower intensity type commercial uses.
Sorry, that's what you want?
Yes, sir.
Well, what's the current permission for them? Is it just is it agriculture or a mix?
The Bienvenue Farm is an ex-chicken farm. It's in the process of seeking planning permission for other commercial uses. There is a current planning application in for dry storage. The fencing centre
that's right,
the
other road, isn't it? Yeah.
So that's part very light manufacturing in that they make fencers and put together products to do with, you know, garden sheds and fences and that kind of work. Then there is a garden centre to the northern part of the
Yes,
site.
I've seen those. I've seen both. Well, I've driven past them, but I
Yes.
didn't really go in. But it's quite clear what there's there.
Yeah.
Well, so what's the? And what I'm coming to is, what's the current permission for the fencing? And could that just not stay as it is and be renewed? For example, and the garden, presumably
Well,
the garden centre's got, has that got a retail permission?
It's a little confusing, sir, given that we're in Jersey, and given that the green zone presumes against new development. I've worked with the owners of the fencing centre and the Hidden Garden Company for a number of years. There was an outline planning permission for data centres back in 2014 or 15, I think, which was a very low intensity use, but a bigger building. But they missed the market, putting it very bluntly. And by the time the permissions were in place, it was felt that it wasn't worth pursuing. So it's about trying to make better use of the land for storage, low intensity type commercial uses, which under the current green zone policy is a challenge.
So what are you seeking it to be, the zone extended as a designated industrial site to which EY1 would apply?
Well, a qualified, and I hesitate
so,
to speak
well,
for Deputy Morell, but I'm aware that his
does
proposition...
he own the site?
No, he doesn't, but he's said that he's put in the proposition to support.
I suppose, well, do you want to respond, Mr. Pelly? I mean, I suppose the other question is, how would that fit in with the industrial designations under EI1? If you want something slightly different, you don't want it as an industrial zone, effectively.
I'm not sure I've got an answer.
Okay. My microphone keeps shutting off and not through me, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. Mr. Pilley, how do you respond to this? Let's deal with this site.
Yes, sir. We assess this site as part of the call for sites, and as you say, Deputy Morell has lodged an amendment in relation to this particular site, sir. Whilst it is related to an existing protected industrial site up there, Thistle Grove is one of our protected industrial sites, and it does benefit from access to the primary route network. As suggested previously, however, we would suggest that rather than this being designated as an extended industrial site, that any proposals to reuse or intensify the existing uses on other parts of the site just be tested through the more flexible planning policy framework that's being set out in the bridging plan, sir.
Is there a technician here? I'm sorry about this. You'll have to keep telling me. My microphone keeps switching off. But I'll try and remember to do it. Just remind me, please. Okay, I don't think we can really take that one any further, unless you've got any other comments, Mrs. Stephen. The next one on the list is La Solitude Farm. Who is anyone representing? Is that you again?
I'm sorry, sir, that's me again. It's
You
not
don't have to
about...
apologise, that's all right.
This isn't about designating the site under EI1. It's more about making sure that there is more flexible provision through the Coastal National Park policy that this site would become part of. And
Yes, I've noted that, and I've driven past it. I mean, the access is not very good, is it? I think
No.
you would have to admit.
No, and I'm not trying to argue for a moment that it becomes a site for increased intensity and unfettered intensity of use, but I know, again, from discussions with the owner, that they're looking to make changes that improve and allow their business to adapt to, you know, current needs and responses, but the Coastal National Park policy appears very restrictive, which, again, you know, giving confidence, putting together a planning application, it's difficult, and it's about asking for a little bit more certainty and encouragement through the policy regime.
I can't. I sort of stopped and just had a look. I mean, there's some old agriculture. There are some older agricultural buildings there, aren't there?
Yes.
As well as a new one, maybe. Is there a car? There's a car repair place there.
Yes, there's a garage workshop. I don't think it's a showroom.
No, I wouldn't have thought so.
Yeah,
I didn't see anyone any cars for sale anyway.
But it's, I believe, one of the island's a catering business.
Oh yes, yes.
So it's got
Mhm.
kitchens, and believe it or not, that is, you know, a very busy, successful business. And I would highlight it as an example of, you know, what happened or what has happened in Jersey. The old agricultural groups have evolved and adapted, and it's about businesses having some confidence through the planning process to continue to do the same.
Okay, Mr. Pilley, do you have any comments on that then?
Yes, sir. I think I'm a bit perplexed as to which policy it's felt is constraining the potential changes to this site, sir. Reference is made to a Coastal National Park policy. There is no Coastal National Park policy, sir. There's a landscape character policy which is set out in NE3.
That's NE3. Yeah, we talked about that.
That's right,
the other day,
and that would
NE3.
need to be read together with any proposals for changes to the site under the proposed EI1, sir. So I think it's important to be clear about the policy regime that applies to this particular situation. The places policy of the plan recognises that the countryside is a living and working environment, and there are existing businesses that exist there. So the policy provision, as I say, sir, at EI1 allows for further development of existing assets, and that would be tested simply against the landscape character policy, so despite the fact that it sits in the Coastal National Park.
Well, so what you seem to be saying to Mrs. Stephen is that the owners of the site, if they wanted to do any development works there, would have to prove either that it didn't harm or that what they wanted to do was actually going to improve the appearance of the park and meet the requirements of ERE4, isn't it?
Well,
or
I think
is that if it's a modern farm building, what about the old farm buildings?
yeah, well, I think it depends on. I think it depends on the nature of the proposal, sir, and which
They've
buildings
got a mixture. I think
they're
they've got a-
related to. But
They've got a mixture, I think, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, there are some old traditional buildings. There's some modern sheds that have been converted. And apologies, old habits die hard. Coastal National Park policy, I didn't mean to cause confusion. But what if they wanted to knock something down and rebuild as an extension? Where do we look to for policy support for that, given that it's in the Coastal National Park? Sorry, it would be in the Coastal National Park designation.
well, sir, I think it would need to be assessed under EI1, and then the landscape impact would need to be assessed under NE3. But if there is a case for delivering some environmental improvement and environmental enhancement, then that would be obviously a positive consideration under NE3, sir.
I don't think we can take that any further either, really. We've had it. I'll consider the. I mean, just to be clear, though, you're not actually asking for an industrial designation. What are you asking for? Anything else? in terms of the changes to the policy context?
Without, I don't want to repeat what we've
No,
discussed
okay,
previously.
all right.
So I think the
I'll have a
points
look at the
been made,
wording of
sir.
the policy
Thank you.
and whatever. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rondell Farm. Who was is anyone? Is that you again?
I'm afraid it is.
Okay.
And
This is a
similar-
slightly different. Well, it's sort of quite a large. It's quite a large complex, so a lot more open position, isn't it?
Yeah.
What are you seeking there?
The owners are seeking designation, I think, sir, under EI1. And if not that, then same request for clearer support for commercial alternatives in what would be the green zone.
The states have. Do you have any comments on what the states have said about the location of the site and the access to it?
The access has been subject to some improvements as a result of a previous planning consent for one of the sheds on the site. And I think, sir, the request highlights the pressure that existing industrial or commercial areas are under, that the owners of the farm are being approached and seeking alternative business uses. There is a junction improvement that is underway, I believe, as a result of the previous planning permission.
Where?
Onto, and forgive me, I have
At
to
the junction of the site to the road, or?
onto the main road, the main St Helier up to St John's Road, La Grande Route de St Helier, I think it is. Can't remember the name of it.
Is that? Well, I
Thank
don't.
you. Mr Nicholson tells me it's La Grande Route de St Jean.
Forgive me, I won't know whether that's been done or not because I only
It
went
is.
there once. So, can you? Okay, Mr. Pilley, how do you like to respond to this request? For
I'm not aware of the
designation?
planning history of the that's referred to, sir, but I think we would still argue that notwithstanding any junction improvements, the site is still accessed by a relatively narrow country lane where two-way traffic would have difficulty passing one another, and I think we would make the same submission, sir, that any proposals to intensify the use of the site could be considered under the proposed policy regime in the draft plan.
But you maintain it's not suitable as a designated area because of its location and the access, or
whilst it's in terms of its relative remoteness, it's obviously has a better relationship to the built-up area than some of the other sites that have been suggested, sir. So it's not that far from town. I think the key issue here, as I've stated, is the restricted access to the site once you leave the primary road network, sir.
any other comments, Mr. Stephen, before I move on? Okay. Mr. Nicholson, I think this is your site, Field 380, and you you actually proposed it as a residential site involving some demolition of the building that backs onto the site to get proper access to it. The same would apply for an industrial development, I assume.
Yes, sir. Our submissions actually weren't exclusively residential. It was.
No, I'm not saying they were.
Making the
It
point
was
that
a
this
joint.
is,
It was either. I seem to recall you saying.
Yes, that's it. I think we have 40 submissions in the call for sites for employment land, and this doesn't seem to have been given a a kind of fair crack at the whip, given that the alternative is that the needs that we know about go unmet. This site backs on to an existing light industrial distribution complex. It is in the same ownership as the majority of that complex. The character of the area is already mixed. It represents a rounding off. Access is achievable through the adjacent site in the same ownership. The initial submissions were actually done by my colleague Mike Stein, who's not able to attend this week after the programme was reshuffled.
No,
and I've been to have a look round as well, and I think we discussed previously that there is a hedge and a change in levels. It's my view that that can all be retained as part of any development solution, because there doesn't need to be disturbance to that element, as access is achievable for light industrial purposes through the existing light industrial complex. I think we need to make some positive decisions, and this is a site which sits quite clearly in the spotlight, sir.
Okay, Mr. Pilley, what's your some of this, obviously, I've been and I've had a look at whether it's rounding off or an extension into the countryside. That's your argument, I think, isn't it?
That's right. So I think I would acknowledge the points made and its relationship to existing industrial uses in the area, and the fact that it could be accessed through the existing site. I think the principal concern is the one that we raised in relation to the housing site issue as well. So as this is an extension into the countryside, it's in an elevated site. And it would potentially have an adverse impact on landscape character, sir. So I think that's the key issue of concern from the Minister's perspective.
What's the agricultural use? It's just, I think I had a bit of trouble scrambling up a bank to look at it. It seemed to be just pasture, from what I can remember.
That would be my observation as well from my visit. I don't think it has a crop in it.
And development would have to be at the level of the field, obviously. Well, that's a bit pejorative on my part, but I think that's been accepted as what you've said from where the access would be, and retention of the hedge and the banks around the site on the west and north side, is it? Anyway,
Yep.
So it's an issue of whether it's okay. I've got the main points.
Access,
I think,
through the site linked straight to the primary route network.
Yeah, was there a bus route there?
There is good bus route there, and I believe there's some new bus infrastructure going in as part of the redevelopment of the site immediately to the north-east for the former JEP site.
And you're seeking a sort of industrial warehouse allocation to which EI1 would apply, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Anything else to say, Mr. Pilley?
No, sir, nothing else to add.
Right, that just leaves ports of Jersey, B26 and B27. Now, just to clarify for me, I didn't sort of quite pick this up initially. You seem to be, Mr. Tanner, is it? Yeah.
Yes.
You seem to be seeking, are you seeking an industrial designation, or, I mean, is it a sort of site-specific, you want an MOT station, I've read on it, is that correct?
Yeah. So
Which is it?
At the moment, the proposal in support of government is to stick a vehicle testing site on there.
So what do you want the plan to do about that?
We would like it to reflect that it should be light industrial in that area.
So you effectively, to get that, you'd have to be seeking an industrial designation like
Yes.
under EI1. One of the things, I've been there, looked at it, I know what the access is like. I don't think the states are raising an issue about access to the site. They did raise this issue about oil installations within the airport, which I didn't really not see. Well, I saw it, but I'm not quite sure of the significance of that, and I'd quite like to explore. Do you have a sort of the equivalent of the HSE on Jersey?
Yeah, so we have our own health and safety inspectorate, and when it comes to hazardous installations, they do defer to the HSE PADI guidance where that's applicable.
Okay. And have they been consulted and commented on this? Sorry, that's gone off again. Yeah, have they been consulted? Have your health safety? What do they call it? It's health and safety
Inspectorate.
Inspectorate, not executive.
So at this stage, there's been no need to consult with the HSI because the planning policy framework established for the hazardous area is quite explicit. So we are able to kind of understand the high-level kind of risk issues that would need to be taken into account. In discussing the development of the plan, we have had a meeting with Ports of Jersey to explore the issue further and highlight the need to kind of undertake a high-level risk assessment, which would have to account for the type and nature of use. So at this point in time, whilst you don't know the nature of people frequenting the site, it's very, very difficult to get an understanding of the level of risk that may be posed and orientation of buildings, etc.
Right, but any comments? I mean, is that? I mean, so you're not. You're not seem to be saying that the location of these oil installations effectively sterilises any development on the site?
No, it doesn't. So in this particular case, the HSE PADI methodology isn't applied in the same way as it would be, say, for La Collette, which is that's a coma site. It's a far greater hazard risk, and it has a very clearly established framework for considering development sensitivity relative to the type of development. So it becomes slightly more of a grey area. It is the northwestern part of the site that is affected by what would be probably like an outer area of the hazard. We have appreciated also that the level of fuel storage.
Okay. So many bits here. Oh, it's here. Yes, that's where. Well, that's where I looked at it from. Actually, there's a gate. There's a gate into a field entrance. The field entrance there, right? It's the north corner, effectively.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So.
Where are these oil installations?
So, can you see? Do you have a?
I'm looking at an aerial photo here. There seems to be a building, a long building above the site.
So
there's a car park into it, and then then there was a little, would look like little office blocks or old offices.
So just within the operational area of the airport. So if you go to the western half of B45 and go directly north of that into the operational area of the port, that's where the fuel storage happens. So over the course of the last decade, fuel storage has increased on the site, but we haven't yet been able to undertake a wholesale reassessment of the risk. That's something that the bridging plan aspires to do both for La Collette and the airport fuel farm areas. So we would very much like a further assessment to be undertaken. Said at this point in time, when we're talking about a designation on a map, it's difficult to say with any real certainty the level of risk that would be posed, because we do need to have a lot more detail.
Yes, what's your comments on that?
So obviously, subsequent to our submissions, we've been undertaking a master planning exercise at the airport, and we've asked them to do an assessment, a risk assessment of the fuel farm, which is now complete. That's been completed in the last couple of weeks, which shows the level of risk in the peripheral. So we understand that now, and obviously you wouldn't be able to put housing or anything like that into those fields, but in terms of light industrial, as suggested, it's perfectly acceptable within the risk factors that you would expect on the blast zones.
Well, that's not before me, though, is it? Or
No,
before
this
us?
is only just been completed, but it's something that we would share naturally with our colleagues in planning.
Yeah, but that leaves me in a bit of a position, doesn't it, in terms of how I deal with your representations and what we recommend about this site. I've got some other questions. I mean, any comments on that?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's difficult.
What do you think I should
Yeah, it's difficult because the PADI methodology doesn't directly apply here, but it would be what would be the equivalent of the outer zone, so that's the least sensitive area, and where some light industrial type uses might be acceptable. But like I said, until you know the population profile of that site, and bearing in mind this would be a highly public site because people will be taking their vehicles there to be tested. It wouldn't be just operational operatives on site at any one time, that we would have to factor that in, but that would have to come through much more detail about the site arrangement, the hours of operation, the nature of the operation. It's not something that you can just deal with on a mapping basis only. I mean, I would say that the hazardous area, as we've identified on the draft bridging plan proposals map, is a minor encroachment to the north, but until we see the evidence that re-evaluates that in light of the changes to the airport fuel farm, we're not in a position to say that it would be okay.
Oh, no, okay.
So, as we discussed last week, this wider Lekenna Bay area has undergone quite a lot of change in the plan period, much of which has actually happened outside of the policy framework of the plan. So, would, I suppose, be seen as departures from the plan. So, the area has felt a deal of development pressure, and we would certainly like to evaluate our position with that in the development of the West of Ireland planning framework.
Sorry, I put my microphone on. We've worked with Ports of Jersey
Well, mine's just...
on this site. So there's just a few issues in response to the Minister's comments, which I wanted to just draw out. The text of the Minister's comment says there's no evidence being provided as to whether other potential sites are available. In that regard, I'd like to defer back to the points I made at the beginning of this session about the Minister's own evidence base and the inspector's comments in the 2011 Island Plan. We make no positive designations, and the evidence is pressing. It has been for during the last iteration of the Island Plan as well. The second point is about the industrial uses within the hazard zone. And the Minister's response again says we'd like to explore long-term development opportunities at La Collette. La Collette is totally covered by hazard zone at the moment. That may change, but even in the current context, La Collette accommodates active light industrial uses, and any proposal would need to be would need to have the PADI guidance and the site-specific risk assessment factored in.
So PADI guidance, is that? I know you referred to that. Is that just is that an acronym for?
It's the UK Health and Safety Directive.
Okay.
They have a planning and land something development framework. It's basically a matrix of sensitivity and distance.
Yeah.
sensitivity and distance, and it's quite straightforward. It's quite user-friendly to apply it. And my understanding is that says don't advise against, but that a specific risk assessment would be used. Third point, so, is about landscape value, and the site at the moment is apparently part of a strategic visual gap. And we heard this about some of the housing sites. There's no such designation as a strategic visual gap. It seems to be a phrase that's dropped into responses when when there is another term that doesn't come available. If strategic gaps are a thing, a constraint, they should be designated, sir, so we know what we're all looking at. But the Minister, in his concluding comment, says he's unable to support these fields at this time. I think the issue of time is sitting above all these designations. We've kicked the can down the road once. We look to be kicking it down the road again. And I just don't think that is the way we should be dealing with pressing employment needs, sir.
Yes, all right, I've got those points. I might want you to come back on that. You actually, I was going to ask about La Collette. I mean, because it seems to me, I mean, is from your point of view, the Ports of Jersey point of view, is the use of this site as an MOT testing station, station, the best use of the site? And could the MOT, have you got any other proposals for the MOT testing station? Where is it at the moment?
So, if I may, there isn't one. So this is introduction of testing to vehicles.
So you don't have MOTs on Jersey?
No, we don't, which might explain
that
some
might
of the vehicles you see
of my hire
driving
car.
around.
Oops, I shouldn't really have said that. But anyway.
Yeah, so we've been working with government on the assessment of potential sites that would be possible to locate a vehicle test centre, and this site has come out as the considerably the most favoured site for them in terms of access and suitability in space.
In terms of sites that you own?
No,
or
sites
the states,
across the island.
The states own across the island?
Correct, sir. Yes.
Is there nothing on La Collette?
Unfortunately, La Collette is somewhat congested. I think it's fair to say it could be that area is freed up in the future.
I haven't really been around there. I don't know whether you think I should.
Yeah, I think it would probably be useful.
We could easily do that, I suppose. It's not too
Yes.
difficult, but
and not all that land obviously is not in the ownership of Ports of Jersey, as discussed earlier, and the light industrial activity that you see in La Collette on Ports of Jersey land tends to be associated with maritime activities. And it is very, very limited in terms of warehouse space.
And you're saying, but then there's nowhere else at all?
Not on Ports of Jersey's land. And on the other sites that the team are looking at on the vehicle inspection team, this is the highest scorer by some margin.
Yes, and be careful how I mean, I could... let's just say that's understandable, given the location of the site and the access that it's got. It's for me to take a view about landscape. I mean, my only other comment would be, it seems quite a big site for an MOT, just an MOT testing station. Is that the development requirement for all of that?
So we're working on the development requirements that the team from Government Jersey have given us in terms of the space that they require. We have challenged back that they perhaps don't need all that space, but that's still to be worked through with the team into a final design. But I think that perhaps presents opportunity in how we use the space and protect it in terms of the overall impact on the landscape.
What's the to the south? Is that part of the school? Is that part of playing field?
There's some playing fields, so they're not part of the school, but they are owned by the public of the island. So that's protected open space, and then the school is to the south of Rue Carré.
There's no space, and then to the west there's another field.
Yes, sir, there is. That's correct.
Who owns that? Do anyone know? Do we know?
I think you're talking about the one that's Ports Jerseys as well?
I don't know.
Yes.
I mean, immediately
Yes.
to the south, there's this.
Yes, to the west. Then yes,
Looks like there's a scrub area, I think.
yes, correct. That's Ports of Jersey's land.
But then there's another field as well.
Yep.
So you own that as well.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other comments from anyone? Mrs. Day?
If I may. One key thing is that the Minister for the Environment recognises the strategic need for a site to be identified for the vehicle testing centre. We've made international commitments. There's enabling legislation in place, but we don't yet have a centre to undertake the vehicle inspections. So we're very happy to work with Minister for Infrastructure, Ports of Jersey, whoever it may be, to find an appropriate site. But through this process, we haven't been directly involved with that. So whilst discussions might have been ongoing within government, they haven't formed part of the island plan deliberations, and that's...
You haven't seen Mr. Tanner's list?
No. So, as I say, we're very, very happy and keen to find an appropriate solution to this. It is very important, but in the absence of any evidence of which sites have been considered and why they've been discounted, it's very difficult for the Minister for the Environment to endorse the designation of a greenfield site for this purpose. Of course, that may be the longer-term conclusion once the evidence of appropriate site review has been provided, and of course there's still opportunity within this process to do that. But at this present time, we simply don't have that evidence, and we would welcome it should it be made available.
Well, yeah, I think we're getting a bit confused with almost like a development control issue here for a specific use, aren't we? I mean, that's not what I can effectively do. I mean, I could. What I've been asked to recommend is for the site to be an industrial warehouse site designated under EI1.
So the Minister is able to designate land for any specific purpose, and as I say, it's recognised that there's a strategic need for this development to take place on the island.
But how would that work with the plan then?
So in order for us to make a designation for this specific purpose, we need to be satisfied that no alternative sites exist, no more suitable alternative sites exist.
So you could actually just put a line around this site and say MOT testing centre.
We could.
In accordance with your regulations.
We could.
Okay.
I'll just make a very minor point of clarification, sir. It was a property holdings kind of sieve analysis and the site search that included Ports of Jersey land. It wasn't just Ports of Jersey.
No, I think I got that from Mr. Tanner, thanks.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay, has anyone else got any comments on this? Right. Okay. Thanks. Does anyone want a short break? Or should we just crack straight on? Crack straight on. Well, you're majorly involved in this, but you'd like to crack on. Yeah, okay, that's fine by me. I just thought I think we've got time. Okay, so thanks for that. I mean, is anyone not involved with policy EV1 wishes to leave, they're welcome to. But let's go on then. Okay. Right. Good morning. You're the Minister for Economic Development. Yes, I was aware you're here. Now, let's start with the Minister for Environment first. You published policy EV1, and then you've, in your state's response 59, you've said in response to some comments made about changing uses of tourist properties, that you're now recommending a change to the policy as published in green, which essentially, I'll just read these out to sort of refocus our minds about what we're talking about here, saying that you will not support a change of use from visitor accommodation in a tourist destination area or outside the built-up area, unless it demonstrates 3 criteria: not technically feasible to refurbish, extend, adapt or redevelop to meet current requirements. That's number 1. Number 2B, demonstrate there's no market demand for the continued use of the premises of visitor accommodation. So the market test that the gentleman over there was talking about is now included. No unacceptable adverse effect on the intrinsic character of identified tourist destination areas. And fourthly, D, overall benefit to the community of the proposal demonstrably outweighs the adverse effects of loss of visitor accommodation. Now, we had that stirred up or generated quite a lot of comments and objections to it. What was the basis? What was the evidence basis for doing that? Was it just the comments that you'd received from people, or was it through anything else? What prompted the change from your point of view?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of points to make in relation to that, sir. Firstly, the evidence base that was commissioned as part of the draft island plan produced by Arup, that was the employment study, did recommend that the plan might seek to protect visitor accommodation from further loss. And it's probably worth saying, sir, that the industry has been going through some structural change for some considerable period of time. And indeed, over the current plan period, 15 hotels, for example, have been net loss from the from existing stock.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've read, well, yeah, so that refers back to the Arrow report with the visitor accommodation, and you might not be surprised now, I've had some anecdotal evidence from taxi drivers about that, actually.
I'm sure they're
they're losing business.
Very well informed.
But
about
anyway,
that's
not something I can really take into account, obviously. But so, I mean, but I assume that's an undisputed, fact that the tourist business is changing, and is still changing, and possibly as a result of COVID. Clearly there have been some big problems, but we're now hopefully looking to rebuild it, but it might be in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's right, sir, and I think as we've indicated, there has been a structural change going on for some time. Obviously the pandemic has had an impact as well, and I think the Minister was concerned that obviously there were comments raised in relation to the consultation on the draft plan, that there was no market test for visitor accommodation. In addition to which, we have seen since the publication of the draft plan, a number of hotel sites come forward for redevelopment. At the beginning of the year, our colleagues in Development Control advised us that they had inquiries, whether in the form of formal applications or pre-application advice, affecting a number of hotels, and that totalled about just under 2,000 bed spaces. And I think we've seen a number of those sites come forward for development proposals since that period of time. So I think
have
there's
you got any, you've talked about the evidence base, the previous evidence base. Did you mean the Arup report, particularly on that?
That's right, sir. Yes, I was originally referring to the Arup report.
And then have you got any numbers of what's happened in terms of applications over the last year? Have you got any figures on that for me?
Not to hand, but we can provide those, sir, in terms of the sites that have come forward that have got consents since the publication of the draft plan. Some have been referred to in some of the housing sessions, sir. For example, there was a recent consent for the Stafford and Revere hotels in Kensington Place. They've got between them about just over 200 beds, so we can provide that, obviously provide that detail from our planning application.
Okay,
system.
I mean, just factual that no one needs really to comment on. I think I'm happy. I'd be quite like to see that, I think.
Yeah.
Just to sort of try and gauge the extent of the issue.
We can provide that, sir. So I think the Minister's concern was that there clearly is pressure on these sites, and they have under the current policy regime, they are not subject to any form of market test. They're just subject to normal planning considerations, if I can put it like that, sir. And they have been a useful source of housing supply. We have seen a change in the loss of, if I can call it, lower grade hotel accommodation, and that's been an important source of housing supply. In addition to which, we have seen some investment in some of the higher end hotels, and also specific hotel accommodation like a Premier Inn. But I think the Minister was generally concerned that the plan should explore whether it was appropriate to have some form of test. But it's important to make the point that that doesn't preclude a change of use from visitor accommodation to other forms of use, subject to those tests being satisfied that you outlined.
And then we've got quite a few comments. I want to start with you, I think, Minister Farnham, about this. I mean, the first point is really, if what if are you saying that if it's not technically feasible to refurbish, extend, which is quite a high bar test in a way, or which way you look at it, I suppose, or low bar test. Generally, one can do something to refurbish. Unless I suppose the building was in such a desperate state to meet future requirements. Usually things are technically feasible. Are you saying if that's the case, you would then not even bother to go on to the market demand proposal, because it could be technically feasible, so they would. They could meet that test, but then you've then got the market demand test.
Yeah, I think this is an issue of bringing older hotel stock up to modern day standards, and I think there's a question of viability that comes into that as well, sir, in terms of the we have a lot of hotel stock, or we did have a lot of older hotel stock that may not have or may not meet the expectations of current visitors, so it's simply that trying to reflect that particular aspect of the demands of tourists of today, rather than tourists who may have visited the island in years gone by.
Yes, okay, all right. Senator Farnham, would you like to comment on that? Start going with these criteria. I've got you've submitted a further representation of 22nd of October, which I've got. I've also got something which I think was sent through you, possibly from Visit Jersey. Yeah, it was. Would you like to sort of kick off from your side?
Can I just sort of raise a couple of points from my written submission, just to reinforce them, if that would be helpful. And from the first principle, this modification proposed by the Minister, I believe, would all but mark a return to the prime site policies of the 1980s and the 1990s, and that policy had largely been discredited given its widely acknowledged negative impact on our tourism economy.
Yeah, for my benefit, just can you I haven't read that. Gone back to it. I've read it in your statement. What was that? What did that policy say?
It prevented. There was an assumption, or maybe my colleagues across the way would help with the exact wording of it. But it did not allow the redevelopment of hotel sites. So once a hotel was there, it had to remain a hotel. And that actually stifled investment in the sector for, I think, up to 20 years by forcing hotels, old stock of hotels, to remain in the market. You see, the hotel stock isn't, the market isn't being forced down by the reducing number of hotel beds. It's the other way around. The reduction in hotel beds is responding to the market.
The demand for that sort of accommodation has changed, and the holiday. So so what has Jersey moved away from what was traditional, what I call bed and breakfast type of
absolutely.
family beach holidays with people flying in in the 70s and 80s.
And whilst there is still an element of that type of holiday, I believe our hotel stocks are adjusted so it remains commercially viable. So accommodation businesses of that era were or are a poor fit for the changing market, and were trapped in a deteriorated state to the point that they arguably began to harm the island's tourism destination status. Since the prime site policy was discontinued, there has been significant investment in tourism accommodation in the form of both new establishments and major refurbishments of existing hotels. These hotels do tend to be in the 3, 4 and 5 star markets, so in the upper echelon of the sector, so but responding to consumer demand.
So when was that policy dropped? In the 2011 plan, was it?
No, Kevin, can you help me with that?
Yes, sir. The prime sites policy that the Senator refers to, it was introduced as an interim policy back in November 1999. So that was when it came about, sir, sponsored by the Planning and Environment Committee, as it then was. It was incorporated into the draft of the 2002 Island Plan, but following engagement with the Tourism Committee, it was then withdrawn from the draft plan, so it didn't actually make it into incorporation into the 2002 plan. But as the Senator suggests, it was active for a period of time leading up to the 2002 plan. So that's when it came about, and perhaps just by way of just by way of some further clarification, sir, it does differ from the proposal that the Minister is proposing at this stage, at this time. What the prime sites policy did, sir, is it had a scoring model which was operated effectively by the Planning and Environment Committee, so that it was the committee that sought to assess the primacy, if you like, or the significance of hotel sites in terms of testing whether or not they ought to be retained in the marketplace. That's not what we're proposing in the Minister's proposed amendments. It's not something that government is seeking to test in itself. It's putting that test out to the market, sir, rather than seeking to impose a government assessment of it. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so. But forgive me, one more question.
Your mic is off, sir.
It wasn't. You've said in the tourist areas or outside the built-up area. So, but from my memory, the tourist areas are just sort of stars on the map, aren't they? Or have you got detailed maps?
No, we haven't defined them in terms of a detailed spatial definition, but they are related to the built-up areas of St Brelade's Bay, St Aubin, Gorey, and then into St Helier.
Okay, just a minute. So you're saying that they're actually the built-up area. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the other point to make in relation to that, sir, is we also have a number of hotels that are important for the island's tourism offer that sit outside of the built-up area. And I think this policy is seeking to ensure that were any of those hotels to come forward for a change of use, then it's important that they be subject to some form of market test to see whether or not the industry would wish to continue those hotels in those locations, simply because it's unlikely that consent would be secured for new hotel accommodation around the coast and the countryside under the new policy regime. Clearly these hotels have been there for some time, and they do occupy particularly significant spots around the island, sir.
Yeah, okay. So, Senator Farnham, I did interrupt you, but just to try and get some factual information. So, do you want to move back onto the market test issue then, and maybe refer to the ones outside the built-up area?
If we if we turn to the details of the specific test being proposed, I believe these tests set the bar so high that they are challenging to distinguish from an outright ban. The first test turns on the technical feasibility of refurbishing, extending, adapting or redeveloping existing accommodation to meet current or future requirements. In that regard, so I note that there can be quite some distance between, I think you might have alluded to this earlier, between technical feasibility and economic viability. It seems that there is then an alternative three-part test whereby an applicant must demonstrate that there is no market demand for the continued use of the premises for visitor accommodation, and there is no unacceptable adverse effect on the intrinsic character of identified tourist destination areas, and thirdly, the overall benefit to the community of the proposal demonstrably outweighs the adverse effects of the loss of visitor accommodation. And again, the combination of these three elements, I believe, sets a very high bar. The market demand test is not defined in any detail, but might conceivably demand proof of a total absence of market demand, both now and in future years. For example, this will be an expensive and onerous test for any applicant, and I will suspect could be determined to a certain amount of subjectivity. So that's sort of the concerns.
Yes. Subjectivity in, well, some areas. I mean, with regard to the market demand test, I mean, that, you know, that requires full open accounting, doesn't it? And viability. I've got several comments about this. Yes, okay.
From the Jersey Hospitality Association.
Oh yes, hello.
Can I just add from what Mr. Farnham's just said, that the actual, there is a tourism strategy which is being developed at the moment, and we're still, how can we align some decisions about this without having the strategy being actually up in the open? This is just really, there's just too much impact on the hospitality to add if we haven't got a strategy to follow and be aligned for. That's just an adding on and agreeing to everything that Mr. Farnham said.
Yes, okay. Scott?
So I believe you asked a question in the search for objectivity that hasn't been answered, because the general position, as I understand it, is that certain hotels depend on financing to improve their product, and that could well be related to the capability of their site being developed for residential development. So I would have expected, when you asked how the test had been devised, for somebody to refer to some sort of review of the financing documents that could actually, they are relevant, and the extent to which the test might not offend this sort of financing, so that hotels that need this type of financing don't go bankrupt, which of course you and I neither have heard anything about. But in addition, as the SBBA has submitted in its further, I should say the St Brellard's Bay Association, of which I'm chairman, in our submission we have pointed out that not every hotel requires this financing, and also that one may well kind of, and very much should, to consider current hotel owners, but one should also consider the possibility of external investment coming into hotels, and actually encouraging hotels that can no longer operate or because of their own kind of arrangements, rather than just have owners of hotels potentially just cash in because they could get residential value for those properties. So I would submit that you haven't yet had evidence that this market test has been devised with those financing arrangements specifically reviewed. Also,
So what you're saying then, are you in favour of a market test, but you think this is the wrong one, or it needs to be refined?
I would question whether it reflects economic reality for those hotels that require financing on the basis of residential value. But as we have also said in our submission, this is not, that data hasn't really been provided on how many hotels rely on this type of financing. The SBBA did do its own review of hotels in St Brelade's Bay, and we did contact the Minister for the Environment, Economic Development, just explaining the results of our review, and that there's a very limited number, we understand, that actually have this problem, as it were.
So, but sorry, I'm not quite following you, I don't think. Are you talking about sort of mixed developments where a refurbishment of a hotel that needs to be upgraded is partly subsidised or funded through part redevelopment of the site or development of a site with some residential accommodation to make it viable?
If I put
or
it simply,
changing a hotel use to, say, a composite use or a mixed use of part residential and part hotel?
so I'm talking about the extent to which hotels, certain existing hotels, in order to finance their products, or actually to borrow money from banks or whatever, have to secure it with the value of the property on which that loan is secured, and they can get a lot more money, to put this very kind of like in layman's terms, if the site is capable of being developed as residential. So if you take away that ability, you reduce the value of the security, sir.
Well, okay, yes, I do sort of understand that, but then they why would they continue to develop at a less profitable use? I mean, that's what the policy is trying to stop, isn't it? If they could develop it more profitably for housing, why would they do that rather than just use that as security and then use the money to continue as a hotel business that's less profitable than maybe redeveloping the site? Well, if they can do that.
I assure you I have evidence they do, because if banks and finance companies do not value hotels that are as the prime policy kind of demonstrated, they don't value hotel businesses as much as sites that can be developed for residential value. So on the basis that a hotel wants to continue as a business and is kind of optimistic that they will recoup the money down the line, okay, that's the basis on which they may well borrow.
Okay, yeah, I understand the point now. I mean, well, if that's what happens, so you're saying that the revised policy and the tests it includes would prevent a residential security valuation for the hotel that might wish to continue in that way. Yeah, okay.
I'm saying what the question that needs to be explored here is whether the tests could jeopardise the financing of some hotels in the island. And I do not know if that investigation has been carried out. I can't see from the evidence that has been provided by the Minister.
Okay, do you have a comment, Mr. Pilley?
We haven't sought to explore that issue, sir, although it is, I think it's relevant to note that that's a point made by the industry, sir, in terms of their ability to secure finance for reinvestment in the quality of the hotel stock may be prejudiced if the finance companies can't see an alternative value on the assets.
Senator Farnham,
Yes, I mean,
any comments on that?
That's
whole,
absolutely
that point?
a very valid comment by Ms Scott. Quite simply, put restrictions put on future use of a piece of land are likely to impact upon the values, and that in itself will lead to the banks or finance providers having to reassess how much and under what conditions they lend on perhaps reduced valuations, and also the appetite of the owners of the property, or whether they wish to invest when there is limited future use for that particular site. And I think in the absence of the prime site policy, that's why we've seen significant investment in existing and new stock. So the Visit Jersey demand analysis has showed signs of evidence that there's a gap between the accommodation that we have and the accommodation that we need. So the best way forward, I believe, to develop our economy would be to allow the tourism product that is perhaps not in high demand from consumer to reinvest in its land stocks, and put all of our focus on encouraging new hotel build and investment in the existing stock that consumers are demanding.
But yes, just trying to think my way through this in terms of if it sort of implies, doesn't it, that if someone goes to a bank with a plan to renovate their hotel, and that it's just as a hotel and it hasn't got potential housing redevelopment value, the bank would not lend the money because they think it's probably not going to be viable. Well, if it's not going to be viable, well, if the bank thinks it's not viable, why does the hotelier think it's going to be viable?
Can I give
Mr.
Smith? Mr. Smith is a former banker and head of
It's worth
Jersey
exploring.
business.
I'd like to explore this issue. I mean, maybe.
If I can perhaps help, Graham Smith, Jersey business, 34 years as a banker, Graham Smith, Jersey business, 34 years as a banker, but now I sit in Jersey business. The reality is, if there's any greater degree of subjectivity or tests or restriction in terms of an asset, a bank will take a view on that in terms of, and certainly from what I've seen as proposed, with my banking hat on, that would cause me some concern in terms of the level that I would lend against that asset. Because in reality, over a period of 10, 15, 25 years, assets and the use of assets can change and locations can change. And interestingly, in relation to this, I've spoken with two of the local island valuers on Ireland, professional valuers, and again, that would be factored in. So in some ways, what EV1 is trying to do is help secure the long-term viability and future of the industry. And key to that is investment in terms of the assets, because as the need evolves, investment in those assets is critical. And investment comes from two sources. It comes directly from investors. And Jersey has proven through recent years in terms of Premier Inn and others that there are interested parties who will invest under the current regulations. The other area is in terms of existing hoteliers who will reinvest in their premises. And certainly those that I speak to, this causes real concern in terms of the long-term value of those assets, both their own personal investment and also from a borrowing perspective. So in essence, it actually works against investment into the industry. And if you look at other locations and jurisdictions where they have tried to control through this method, that has stymied investment. And rather than through restrictions, to me, it is more around in terms of how can we make the investment environment more attractive. And what the options along those lines are what will increase investment in the industry. Whereas what's proposed, in my view, from a banking experience, will potentially reduce investment.
Yeah, but it's not really answered my point, has it? Sorry, I mean, well, I don't think I'm a complete economics novice, but it was a long time ago when I got my degree. But if you know the bank, you're saying the bank will loan on the security of a possible residential redevelopment,
No, well,
basically,
the-
and that
Yeah.
and
No.
they will loan a higher amount than they would on the security of just a hotel asset.
It's degrees in the sense that they're not lending on the basis of a valuation for residential, but the more restrictions you put on, the more subjectivity you put on an asset in terms of alternative use generally, that impacts the valuation. And that's what drives the bank's appetite and the percentage that they will lend. But it's not just that, it's the investors
Well, I can see
themselves as
that,
well.
but then, you know, would they, yeah. They're still lending money to something that maybe they think might not be as profitable as something else, but
So
I'm
could
really
I
sorry,
please...
ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing I can do about this, it just keeps cutting out. Okay, the gentleman, no, there's
Yeah,
a gentleman there
if I
from
could
the
come-
Jersey Architects. Hang on, Miss Scott, I'll come to you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm representing the Association of Jersey Architects, and I think we would definitely not support a further constraining policy on rural hotels. Rural hotels, by their nature, and not many of them, large ones left, all in quite sensitive and already constrained sites. So rather than, I mean, if the Minister is particularly keen to encourage rural hotels to flourish, would it be possible for him to consider an enabling policy? Because quite often they're set in the green zone, possibly the coastal national park. If he's really interested in them continuing to develop in difficult circumstances, one way of doing that would be to increase their bed spaces. So why not come up with a policy that facilitates that?
Mr. Pilley.
Yeah, I think the existing policy does, so policy EV1 enables new investment to be facilitated in existing tourism facilities. So I'm not sure there's an issue there. Just on the issue of the market tests and the potential constraints that might impose in terms of potential borrowing, clearly we have market testing that's applied to a whole range of employment land under the current plan and also proposed under the draft plan. And in fact, the only exceptions under the current plans relate to office and visitor accommodation. So, you know, as a general principle, we don't see that as being a key challenge, notwithstanding the fact we recognise it's an argument that the industry makes.
One of your ministers does. I've just realised, I think maybe, can you please make sure you turn your microphone off when you finish speaking, because I think that's maybe why I'm having trouble with the microphone cutting out, because I'm not on my priority one. Yes, okay, Ms Scott.
So,
and then Mr Curtis.
So I understand your bemusement at the idea that banks may not be convinced by a business plan alone. So I do share that sentiment. But I also would point out that data has not been provided on how many hotels in the island are relying on financing this way. I will also point out that the St Brellard's Bay Association did do its own survey, of which we notified the Minister for the Environment, in respect of the 6 hotels, there are only 6 hotels in St Brellard's Bay, which is a key seaside resort in the island, and recognised as an asset. And in fact, we only found that 1 used this financing. We've asked for an independent confirmation of this because we believe that would be appropriate. And we very much hope that the Minister for the Environment will read the further submission that we made to you in this respect, because St Brellard's Bay, in fact, has the 10% of the remaining hotel beds in the island. And whilst Mr. Pilley may well point out that we have sites related to these tourist development areas, they're not very kind of well defined, as you say. So we actually would submit that certainly more work needs to be done on this amendment, but you could consider removing it for a very specific area, being the St Brellard's Bay shoreline and its existing hotels. After, of course, consultation with them, if there was some form of compensation that was necessary, that would be very limited compared to compensating many more hotels in the island. And we very much hope the Minister for Economic Development will look at this and will submit his own amendment to the island plan to support the visitor accommodation situation, because we do have a catch-22 in the form of this amendment.
Well, I mean, let's be clear, what I've been asked to do is to include it, add it to the plan, or recommend. We've been asked to recommend to include it. What about this? I'll come back to those of you in a minute. Mr. Penny, what about the point you just exclude St Bernard's Bay area from this? Have it applying to some areas and not others.
Clearly, the intention of the minister's proposed policy change, sir, seeks to, I think, do exactly what the St Brellard's Bay Association are seeking to achieve, sir, which is to ensure that St Brellard's Bay continues to play an important role in the island's visitor economy, and that it maintains its character as a tourist destination by virtue of the fact that it has a number of hotels that exist in the bay, together with a number of complementary uses, the daytime and evening economy uses, sir. So it would be slightly, it would appear slightly strange to exclude an area which performs such an important role in the tourism economy from a policy that's designed to safeguard that economy, sir.
The Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Mackenzie. Oh yes, I remember reading something from you, Mr. Mackenzie. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Any comments on this?
I really wanted to approach this from a different. There hasn't been much talk about the market here and what the demands of the market are in relation to the visitor economy. So, for example, all we've really heard about so far are hotels. Now, the fact of the matter is that over the last 2 decades, there's been a fundamental significant shift in the demand for accommodation, the types of accommodation that people have been seeking, a move away from the traditional 2-3 star market, much more demand for self-catering, for example. And one of the issues we have at the moment is that the peer-to-peer rental sector, Airbnb being the most well-known area, is, the demand for that is significantly growing. Now, if the properties that are currently classified as hotels are simply not able to develop, not suitable for development into some kind of accommodation that is in demand in the future, and in the future, if we've seen such fundamental change in the last 20 years, what's going to happen in the next 20 years? Then those owners have to have the opportunity, if they're unable to refurbish or change the use of their property to meet the demands of the visitor economy, then they have to have the ability to exit if they so desire. So I think it's very important that we focus on the demands of the market and where that is going in the next 10 years or so. Thank you.
Yes, okay, thanks. I mean, Mr. Pilley, I'm sure will say, well, they have the ability to exit if they meet the tests. But I did want to ask about, you can come back on that, but Airbnb, you seem to do things slightly differently in Jersey in some areas. Is that, I take it that's not a specific use class, or where does that fit in with planning legislation and the use classes order in Jersey?
Well, in terms of the provision of self-catering accommodation to serve visitor use, there would be a change of consent required to change self-catering accommodation to, say, for example, residential accommodation.
Yes, well, I'm thinking more the other way round. Mr. Mackenzie's said, what's happening seems to be happening quite all over Europe, certainly, and the rest of the world is residential accommodation is being changed into Airbnb accommodation, and as from my understanding, at the UK at the moment, that doesn't require any permission, but is actually, one could argue, quite a different use, and it's more of a visitor accommodation use than a residential use.
Yeah, I mean, in Jersey, we've seen more of the proposals to use other buildings for to bring them into self-catering accommodation. So over the current plan period, there's been something like 150 self-catering units brought into use. Most of those come through development on existing hotel sites or tourism accommodation sites, or from proposals.
So that does require permission, sorry?
That does require consent, so yeah, for the provision of new stock.
Self-catering, but that's visitor accommodation?
Yes, that's right, sir. That's
right.
right.
Is it limited to that by condition?
Well, as I say, sir, it would be limited, and you would require consent to change that out of that use. In terms of the point related to making use of existing visitor accommodation to change the type of accommodation offered, I think we recognise the shift in visitor requirements to the island. So clearly we've seen a decline in business visitors to the island, who tend to stay in short stay hotel visits, and more leisure visits to the island, where you may get more families visiting the island who may require more self-catering accommodation. And EV1 would enable existing visitor accommodation to be changed in terms of the type of accommodation that's offered, sir. So I don't think there's any constraints that we would seek to impose on those changes. And also the plan seeks to recognise that there is this demand for visitor accommodation, and it may be in locations which are outside the built-up area. And again, the plan has policy provision to enable those sorts of uses to be considered in the countryside and around the coast, principally where they make use of existing buildings.
Well, that's, yes, it's entirely, isn't it? Pretty much. Reuse of existing buildings. Not new buildings in the green zone.
Although there are some policy provisions where new buildings could be tested, sir.
Okay. Mr. Curtis, you've been wanting to speak.
I do want to highlight, sir, that we are approaching this question and a lot of the planning framework around employment land from a perspective of the landowner as current and their wishes and their intent. And I think if we frame back to Strategic Policy 6, which is around a sustainable and continuing economy, we actually have to consider maybe the current landowner is not the best user of that land for its existing designation class. So, I mean, but that's why we have land classes. If an owner does not wish to use it within that region, they are entirely welcome to dispose of that asset and let another person take it on. So when you look at the problem framed as a new hotelier who wishes to enter the market, under the current policy, there is no easy access to a visitor accommodation stock if we assume that most accommodation is worth more through housing. So like we have a test on...
Well, hang on, that's not, I mean, that's not necessarily... Well, okay, but no, Premier Inn's been developed. I mean, that's a new hotelier coming in.
And they've used an employment site, and that was one route to do so. However, I met a couple the other day who were very interested in owning and running a guest house, and guest house in the form of modern a guest house, without too much details about their plan, would meet the characterisations of niche tourism.
Okay.
They are unable to access that stock of land because the same guest house is worth more through change of use to apartments than it is for a guest house. So a test on market...
So you're supporting the market test?
I'm supporting it, and I think
policy.
It needs to go further. I think it needs to cover every site. We need to apply it to, obviously, as I said, office, but we've moved on. But if we look at the distribution of sites, we are at risk of losing every single hotel and guest house from St Clement's, which I believe every hotel there fits within the built-up area, yet does not fit within a tourist destination area. So as far as having access to a varied market for visitor accommodation, we would entirely lose that. Likewise, if we remove the market test, it might be more valuable to purchase the 5 AI rated Longville Manor for a multi-millionaire and not meet a market test. But clearly that is not in the interest of the island's economy. So a market test is essential. And anyone who's looking to enter the market, or anyone who wishes to invest, needs access to that safeguard to access it. And actually, we are looking at this from existing owners and not from businesses.
Mr. Warrington, you've still got...
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to follow on from the Minister's...
sorry, can you turn your mics off? Mine's gone off again. Yeah.
The Minister's intention with policy EV1 to support hotels outside of the built-up area, the handful of hotels that are coastal and rural. Some of those hotels occupy land, but they have grounds that are partly built-up area where most of their buildings are. They're fringed by green zone and possibly even the wandering coastal national park designation. I think there's a positive, if the Minister is keen to support those hotels, then an enabling policy that allows them to expand potentially into the green zone that surrounds them is something that should be seriously considered. It's probably the only way they can actually help themselves in terms of growth and sustainability. And I think an enabling policy around that would be extremely helpful.
I think you've covered that, haven't you, Mr. Pilley?
I think I have, sir.
All right, okay. Scott, have you got any other new points to raise?
Yes. I probably have not been too clear about exactly what I believe should happen with this market test, which is a new introduction into the island plan. Previously, we basically just said hotels could convert into residential. And I agree there are different forms of exit. You owners can sell to other people who want to develop hotels. But the real point here about this current market test is that it doesn't really prevent a landowner just allowing their property just to become incredibly dilapidated and to argue, well, okay, I can't do anything with it. So whilst I'm also sympathetic to some hotels which may have difficulties with the market test, for me, I'd rather not have this for St Brelard's hotels, subject to confirming the research that the SBBA have done, because I think the market test itself provides loopholes which we don't actually want. And finally, I want to just make the point with respect to a property like the Atlantic Hotel, following on from the point that has been made. Again, you have another good quality hotel, and it will need to improve its product, but it's actually in the coastal national park. It's already in this plan in one of the minister's representations said it shouldn't be allowed to expand. And I believe that isn't particularly supportive of what is a high quality product. And I believe, again, in the Bay, we have high quality products. So it is a thing apart from many hotels in the island.
Okay, Mrs. Steedman, and then I'll come to you if you want to say anything before we wrap up.
Thank you, sir. An observation, there has to be a tourism market for there to be hotels, and given what's been happening recently, that is a question that needs to be understood. We've heard that there is a tourism strategy. That needs to be understood. Clearer definition of the tourism destination areas is a point you've picked up on, sir, and definitely would be welcome and assist with understanding. We have clients, sir, who are hoteliers, and they support the intent for support for the industry. However, they feel that this is not the right policy tool for providing that. This issue needs a much wider conversation, and you've heard some of the thorny issues that need to be discussed and the detail understood. So our request is for this not to be in as part of the plan, sir. Thank you.
Okay, Senator Farnham, do you have anything else? Then I'll ask the states if they want to just conclude on anything else. Having heard all this,
okay, thank you.
would you like to sort of summarise?
I'll wrap up if that's what you
your
mean.
position for the people objecting to the new proposed amendments.
I think just clarify in relation to the financing, because I think this is an important point. Businesses, hotels don't want to fail, and successful hotels can be very profitable, and the owners will want to retain that type of business for long into the future. The banks are interested in what happens if the business does fail, and that's, I think, what we're trying to explain, as is the hotel owner, because before investing or reinvesting in a product, everybody will need to know that what their options are, should, for that example, be another pandemic, which came right out of the blue, which is also, we haven't touched on that, but there are also still unknown impacts on the visitor economy from this, and I think there will be for some time. Again, I wanted to reiterate that the analyses we're doing at the moment is showing evidence that we have, there is a gap between some of the stock we have and some of the stock we need. And I think the point Mr. Waddington was referring to is that we need to, from a planning perspective, do everything we can to encourage new modern stock to be built and developed. So that's really key. And if we start putting restrictions or tests such as being recommended into the market, then I firmly believe that that will be a deterrent, and it will stifle investment and have the opposite impact from what we're trying to achieve. And we've actually seen since we let go of the prime site policy, we've allowed some of the old stock that the consumer wasn't really interested in anymore. We've allowed that stock to go to provide much needed housing, and we've seen significant investment in new modern consumer hotel stock that's in consumer demand. And the government of Jersey wants nothing more than to promote and support a sustainable visitor accommodation sector with the appropriate amount of the right type of hotel bed, sir. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I mean, on that point, what about Airbnb? We haven't really commented on that. I mean, do you have with your minister's hat on, a view on that? I mean, are you happy with the policy context of the plan from promoting that aspect of tourism?
There's certainly a place for Airbnb to support our visitor economy, but there's a juxtaposition with the demand for housing and the cost of housing and the social impact of a housing shortage, especially on our young people. So our tourism strategy will address that to find the right type of balance. What we don't want to see is properties being purchased and utilised purely for Airbnb, which might have a negative impact on the housing market. I'm not so much talking about the self-catering type of property. So more houses. There are examples on Airbnb of full houses now being offered.
Okay, and your tourism strategy, that's coming along later, so I can't really take that into account, other than the fact you're doing one. Okay. Mr. Pilley, do you want to... Mr. Nicholson, you've come in at the end again. What did you want to say?
Well, we've heard a lot, I've got a few points. We've heard a lot about financing and the model, the market position, etc. But I wanted to, if I may, bring it back onto track about planning practice and the issues of drafting in this plan. I've got 4 points. Mr. Pilley started off by talking about the evidence base supporting this. That evidence base was published in December 2020 with no response from the Minister. In fact, the first response was the publication of the draft plan, in which the Minister clearly didn't accept it. He didn't provide justification for that. We now have a very, very late substantive change in SR 59, and that is extremely poor, in my view, in relation to probity and governance. I can
Well, okay, but that, you know, that's the point of having this session, isn't it?
Well,
For that to be tested.
We've now got SR 59A, and in my reading of that, I think you mentioned earlier, sir, that you were being asked to include this change. I think if I read SR 59A, you're actually being asked to draft this policy. In the event of a change to policy being required, the Minister remains open to the form of the policy test that might be introduced. I think you are being asked not only to include it, but to draft it, sir. That brings me on to the second point about what actually is proposed. The changes to the policy are set out in a kind of track changes document, part 6, modification schedule, page 4, and the proposed change is actually inconsistent with the reason for that change. But basic bit of drafting here, changes of use from visitor accommodation where located in tourist destination areas or outside the built-up area. That's in the middle column. In the reason, it says changes of use in the island's tourist destination areas and outside the built-up area. You know, for a deposited document, I'm really not sure what...
Sorry, what I've been working on SR 59. What are you looking at there?
I'm looking at the consultation response summary, the large A3 document,
okay.
part 6, modification schedule, where the proposed changes are set out.
Yes, sorry, all right, that's over there, but I've got that, yeah.
So, there's an inconsistency in the proposed wording. So, we've also got no proposal to change the wording on page 141. I'm afraid I don't have a paragraph number for you, but 141 sets out the general approach to protection of employment land, and it confirms the status quo from the 2011 plan being carried forward in relation to hotels being protected. Hotels not being protected. So there is other text of the plan which also requires change to be made consistent with whatever alteration is actually being proposed. There is also no proposal in the performance framework to redraft the SPG, which is associated with the protection of employment land. If this change is carried forward, there is a whole raft of work which needs to come from it, which is not part of the island plan, and it is not part of the proposed change. Right, so the third...
Well, that's not uncommon, is it?
Well, if we're
well,
being
I mean,
asked,
there have been other things included in that, but okay, I've made a note.
If we're being asked for comment on it, I think everyone should be aware of all the points that we're being asked to comment on. The third point, unintended consequences. Aside from market position and economic reality from the position of the hoteliers, we have heard that the stock of hotels has been a strong source of windfall supply for housing. We know from other sessions that we've been through that the stock in the H1 table relies on the windfall projections being carried forward. There's no analysis of that position in the context of this policy change. This policy change will not represent business as usual in relation to the policy position of windfalls, and we don't know what will happen in relation to the supply of windfall housing sites. So that's a very, very important matter given the uncertainties around H1 generally. The final point in relation to unintended consequences is that this change, in my reading, runs counter to other policies of the plan. We've got H8 talking about residential development outside the built-up area. We've got the text on page 198, which effectively says that hotels outside the built-up area, in the coastal national park, in the green zone, are blots on the landscape. We would like to remove these structures. We would like to remove the trips associated with these intensive uses. And that, in my reading, sits behind a lot of the overall sustainability strategy of the island plan. This change changes that balance completely, and there is no guidance as to how this change impacts on other policies of the plan, particularly H1 and H8. Thank you.
Okay, Scott, I thought you'd finished.
Just quickly, in conclusion, sir, in the context of what could be perceived as a land grab for luxury residential development in St Brelade's Bay from the tourism industry there. I also will link in the Minister's proposals to amend Policy GD9, which seems to be suggesting that there will be development restrictions on hotels in the Bay shoreline zone as well, because it makes no distinction between residential and visitor accommodation. So in a sense, it just adds insult to injury. Thank you.
Yeah, well, perhaps I'll pick up on Mr. Nicholson's.
Sorry, I've
point.
just asked for the record, I've just asked Mr. Pilley to respond and conclude.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, just pick up on Mr. Nicholson's points. The issue about probity and governance, I think clearly the Minister has published a response to the issues that have been raised and asked you to explore a number of those, including some potential policy revisions. Clearly this process is an opportunity for you to test those, sir, and to ensure that they are scrutinised and given a degree of assessment. And so we would suggest that it's entirely appropriate that you test those before indeed the Minister considers formalising them, should he wish to do so through an amendment to the plan. In terms of the issues of inconsistencies, clearly there will always be changes that will have an effect throughout the remainder of the plan. What we're talking about here is the substantive change to the substantive policy, and if indeed change is going to be made to this policy, then that will need to be reflected in other parts of the plan, and it's an entirely accepted protocol that is how changes to key parts of the plan are dealt with, as is evidenced by a number of the States Members' amendments, for example. So
you would, if we agree with the revised Minister's policy, you would expect us to say something, and you would need to deal with consequential amendments.
We would pick up.
We'd just leave you to do that.
That's right, sir. That's right, sir. In terms of the issue of unintended consequences and the impact on something like housing land supply, sir, of course, one of the things we have to remember is this is not a return to the prime sites policy. This is not a prohibition on the change of use of hotels, sir. It is simply a form of qualified regulation of that change, subjecting them to a series of tests. And so in terms of the potential impact on other sources of housing land supply, this policy change is not seeking to prohibit that entirely. So it's seeking to look at some form of qualified regulation. I think I've made the point already, but I'll reiterate it again. Where there are existing hotels outside of the built-up area, this plan does not seek to encourage their closure or their removal from the island's tourism industry. Policy EV1 supports the reinvestment and development of hotels throughout the island, wherever they are. They would simply be subject to the planning policy regime tests that apply to that particular part of the island. And in the case of the Green Zone or the Coastal National Park, that would be principally around the landscape impact. So, and just on the point of Airbnb and tourism accommodation, that is a specific use class in Jersey. Tourism accommodation is a specific use class which embraces guest house, hotels, bed and breakfast and self-catering accommodation. So we would regulate change to and from that use through the planning system, sir.
Okay, just on that point, factual point, what if it's half and half? And we say, you know, if someone has a house and then they leave it for 4 months, or they go away somewhere else in the summer and want to let it out as what happens there? Is that a separate use class?
I'm not sure in terms of temporary form of use, sir. I'm not sure how that would be regulated.
Okay, all right.
I might clarify that. So it's in the definition of development in the law. Short-term holiday lettings, whether they're part are covered in the law as development.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. I think that's it. Thank you very much for your helpful contributions. We're going to adjourn now. I'm going to come back at 2 o'clock for what I think will hopefully will be a brief session on general development policies. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. The session's adjourned. I'm sorry about my microphone. If anyone's, can we try and sort this out over lunchtime, please? Because it's really difficult when I keep cutting out.